in mathematics, we have many different ways of expressing numbers, particularly small ones. So we can represent them as decimals, we can represent them as percentages, we can represent them as fractions, or we can represent them in scientific notation, particularly when they're very, very small. But these are all equivalent to each other, different ways of expressing the same thing. And so you may need to express a particular number in one particular format, or you may need to convert it to another format. And so I want to illustrate how Excel can be useful in doing these conversions for us. Now, particularly for the fractions one, I want to make a note that if your fraction is particularly complex, if you have a very large denominator, these conversions to fractions may not be exact. They may be the closest fraction that it can get to. But I picked a particular fraction for our example that Excel can give us the exact value for. So let's start by taking our decimal number, this one up here, 0.035, and I want to reformat it as a fraction. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my fractions column, I'm going to point at the cell where that number is posted. Now, the default, of course, will be to copy the format that it's originally written in. But what I can do is I can convert this to a fraction. In my header menu here, I have this number formatting box. And if I click on this little down arrow here, then I will get into a list of possible number formats. And one of those is the fraction. Now, I get a lot of examples that I can choose from, a lot of different kinds of formats. So I can display up to 1 digit. Now, you want to be careful with this one because that basically means it can only show you fractions from 1/2 to 1/9 because there's only 1 digit in the denominator. And if you pick this one and your fraction is not very close to one of those, then it will just say 0. I can round to nearest halves, quarters, eighths. There's a number of options that I have for identifying particular kinds of fractions that I may want. But I can also choose fractions that have display up to 2 digits or up to 3 digits in the denominator. So I can choose 16ths. Maybe I'm looking at what's the closest thing on a inch ruler, and then I can mark 16ths, or I can mark as essentially the decimal equivalent of whole percentages. But the one that I prefer the most when I want as close to an accurate representation of the fraction as possible is this option right here with 3 digits. And the reason that I prefer that one is because that one is going to give me the most accurate value. And if it doesn't need 3 digits in the denominator, then it will round the fraction to a smaller equivalent fraction. So kind of like your TI calculator if you're used to using that. So I'm going to hit OK. And so the display is now representing my original decimal amount as an equivalent fraction. In fact, this is the exact value of the equivalent fraction. If I were to type into the cell equals 7 divided by 200, then the decimal value that it would produce is the 0.035. Now, for the decimal one, obviously this is already in decimal form. I can also represent this as a percentage. And the way that I can do that is actually quite easy because fractions are a little weird. I have to go into the menu for them, but the percentage is so common that it's actually just on the main screen, the main home tab. And so if I click %, then it will display it as a whole percentage to start with. And if I want to change the number of decimal places displayed, I can increase the numbers of decimals to get my 3.5. And I can decrease them if I have too many. And then for scientific notation, Now that one, I also have to go into the menu options. So go to my number format tab and then select scientific. And you can choose how many decimal places after the decimal place it's going to display. For our purposes, we can just leave it the way it is. Now, the E here is the equivalent of times 10 to the, and then the number that follows it is the exponent. So this would be read in regular English as 3.5 times 10 to the negative 2. And typically when you're transferring this to paper, not inside Excel, but writing it down on paper, you should replace the E with times 10 to the power. Because the E is calculator notation, essentially. It comes up in computers, you'll see it in your TI, but it is not standard scientific notation when you're writing on paper. Now, let's look at these other examples and also do the conversions for all of these. Now, for the time being, I'm just going to copy them down. Oops, just going to copy them down into the cells. Now, this fraction, we'll see how it works out. When we do the conversion, I may have to insert an equal sign so that it's not treated like plain text. For this example, I had to pick an example that was not going to be treated like a date because Excel is trying to be helpful. Okay, so let's actually look at all of our fractions and see, we go in here. So this is already treated as a percentage. We want to convert it to a fraction. Again, pick the up to 3 digits because this will be the most accurate display. And then it will convert the display. It's still in the background recorded as essentially the decimal equivalent, but it's now displaying it in a fraction format. Same thing here. I can convert this from a percentage to a general number format, and then I can adjust the displayed decimal places so that it displays all of them. This one's already in percentage form, and then in scientific notation, we have to go either into this menu or into that drop-down menu with the little arrow. And so this converted it to the default. If I don't need to adjust the defaults, I can just use this menu. Don't use this for fractions because the default fraction is 1 digit in the denominator and we need 3. And so we need to go into the menu for that. Now let's see what happens. These are treated like text. So let's see what happens if I go in and I select scientific. It didn't do anything because it doesn't understand that this is supposed to be a number and not a text. So I put the equal sign in, and so now it converted for me. So same thing for this one. I don't want it to be treated like text. And so this converted it to a decimal, and now I can convert it to a percent, and we'll display 2 digits. And then same thing for this one, equals. And this is a decimal expression. This is probably more digits than I really need. And so I'll decrease the number of digits to 3. And then this one, if I type it in as an equal sign, the default is to go to a decimal. So if I wanted to continue to display as a fraction, but not as text, then I have to go into my menu. And again, and in fact, I'll just show you what happens if you select fraction from here. It converted to a fraction, but a fraction with only 1 digit in the denominator. And this is too small. It's small, much smaller than 1/9, and it's closer to 0 than 1/9. And 1/9 is the smallest fraction you can get with 1 digit. So you have to go into the drop-down menu down here and then select up to 3 digits. And now it will display properly. And then same thing for this one. Fraction, 3 digits. And then this one, we want that as a decimal, which is just a number format. and we need more decimal places so we can at least see what it is. And then this is our percentage, 0.4%, and this was already in scientific notation. So this is how you can convert from one display to another. And sometimes students, people who are not used to dealing with small numbers, can get really thrown off by the scientific notation. And so it may be useful to you to convert any solution, especially small ones. When you get E -04, that tends to be the default mode of expression in Excel. You can convert these to decimals. You will need space in order to display all the leading zeros, but sometimes converting these to other number formats will remind you, like, this is a really teeny tiny number and not a 4.